So today I will be talking about positive behavior intervention and supports as they apply to the issue of disproportionality and discipline. And we're going to talk about what we can do to intentionally address this issue of disproportionality with this framework. So first, defining the issue of disproportionality. Disproportionality is essentially the overrepresentation of a group in a category or for an outcome in comparison to other groups. So in education, this exists in three places. First, in the achievement gap. Secondarily, in special education, where minority students tend to be overrepresented in categories like learning disability and emotional disturbance. And then finally, in discipline, which is the focus of this presentation. I'd like to specifically say that discipline is referring to exclusionary practices here. So things like office disciplinary referrals, known as ODRs, out-of-school suspensions, known as OSS, and in-school suspension, known as ISS. So there's this phenomenon in education known as the school-to-prison pipeline. And this suggests that when students experience these exclusionary practices, they're more likely to encounter the juvenile justice system, and later on, perhaps even go to prison and be incarcerated. So in education in schools, where we see this manifested for minority students is that Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts. Hispanic students are 1.5 times more likely to be suspended and twice as likely to be expelled than their white counterparts. In the prison industry, we see that 1 in 3 Black men are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1 in 6 Latino men are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. And 1 in 17 white men are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. Now, while none of these numbers are great, when put in the context of the American population, Black and Latino people only make up 13 and 17% of the population. At least that was true according to census data from 2018. And so what we see is this disproportionate or overrepresentation of Black and Latino men specifically in incarceration. Now the same trends or similar trends are true for Black and Latino students, male students specifically, in discipline. So let's talk a little bit about solutions, right? So positive behavior intervention and supports. I'm going to walk you through this triangle, this image on the right. So where you see that green space, if you would implement universal things like behavior expectations that are set school-wide, where everybody knows the expectations, they have examples and non-examples, they know the settings for which these expectations apply, the consequences, reinforcements, all of those things, right? So that works for about 80 to 85% of students. But then for maybe 15 to 20% of students, they need a little bit of additional support. And so you might do things like small groups that specifically address whatever issue they're dealing with. And then for maybe 1 to 5% of students that don't respond to those targeted supports, you have more individualized supports. This is usually by way of behavior support plans when PBIS is in place that are only put in place after you've addressed the function through a functional behavior assessment plan. So you know why the behavior is occurring, right? So thinking behavior as a symptom. And so the definition you can read here for yourself, but there are a couple of things I want to highlight that you see in bold. First, PBIS is a problem-solving approach, right? So you see that tier 2 and that tier 3, that yellow and red, that's addressing and targeting something specific that happened, right? Some behavior and intervention needs to be put in place. But then PBIS is also preventive. So where we see that green space, that tier 1, those are things we're putting in place in advance to make students have clear expectations for what we believe should be occurring in this environment, and setting goals for what that looks like. And then it's systemic in planning. So in addition to having those clear expectations, we know how we're going to respond to behaviors when they are, when the behaviors are appropriate and when they're inappropriate, right? And what are the steps we're going to put in place? And then, unlike exclusionary practices alone, PBIS provides students with alternative skills. So it teaches students what should they do instead, right? So it's this idea that all students have a repertoire. And so in that repertoire, they either have the skills that are appropriate that we just need to enhance, or they don't have the skills and perhaps we need to teach them, right? But it's the idea that students are completely capable of behaving appropriately when given clear expectations. And so finally, it's this idea of changing the environment. So PBIS is a systemic framework. And so what we're saying is perhaps there are things about the environment that we can change in order to enhance the student's educational experience. And so in that tier 3, there is an inclusion of that function-based intervention through FBAs. It's inclusionary, so we're looking to keep students in the classroom environment. And then it's respectful, so we're looking not to marginalize students, but to say that even with behavior issues, you can be included in this classroom, and we know that you can behave appropriately. And so when applying PBIS to disproportionality, it's important that we address what the data says. So first, in 2018, according to the Office of Civil Rights data, a national data set, school-wide positive behavior support schools had lower black-white out-of-school suspension risk ratios than schools without those supports. But substantively, for schools without those supports, their black-white out-of-school suspension ratio was 4.33, as compared to schools with school-wide PBIS, whose out-of-school suspension risk was 3.67. So even though there is a decrease, there is still an overrepresentation of black students being suspended from school. And when in 2016 a study was conducted in which they found in Virginia that African American students had lower out-of-school suspensions when PBIS was implemented with fidelity. And this was compared to schools that did not implement PBIS with fidelity. In 2018, a student conducted a dissertation study for the state of Florida in which they found that schools implementing school-wide PBIS actually did not have lower risk ratios for black males specifically than schools without school-wide positive behavior support in place. But what they did find is that the longer school-wide PBIS was in place, the lower the ratios were. And then when administration was asked, well, what do you think contributed when you implemented PBIS to the lowering of disproportionality? And they reported these things like trainings for teachers and staff, finding root causes of behavior, setting high expectations, and so on. And so thinking about the strengths and limitations of PBIS, and then specifically as they apply to disproportionality, first, we're setting clear expectations. So in that tier 1, clear expectations to all students of what behavior should look like with examples and non-examples. You're using data to set goals, so not subjective. Objectively using data has a team effort, so no one person is responsible for making decisions. You address the causes of behavior. So if we're thinking about behavior as a symptom, right, of some sort of function, some sort of need they're trying to have met, because behavior is trying to communicate a point. With PBIS, we're intentional about addressing that cause. Limitations for schools maybe who don't have the resources might be the issue of collecting data for fidelity, so making sure PBIS is implemented as it was intended, and then training supports that might be necessary for for teachers and staff to put PBIS in place appropriately. But then specifically as it applies to the issue of disproportionality, a limitation of the studies I've discussed is that studies were conducted retrospectively, and so therefore there was a lack of explicit acknowledgement of race and bias, which I will address in the next several slides. So in 2018, McIntosh and colleagues suggested this 5-point intervention to promote equity and address disproportionality in discipline. I want to talk about these 3 things you see highlighted here, just as things you can take away from this presentation. First, disaggregating data. So this is in order to identify whether or not disproportionality is a problem. You see these 3 metrics here. Research suggests that you use at least 2 of these. What I want to highlight is that a risk ratio greater than 1 indicates an overrepresentation of a group, and lower than 1 indicates an underrepresentation of a group. Now, while research suggests that you use at least 2 of these metrics, they suggest you don't use the risk index. So that really only leaves you with the risk ratio and composition. So cultural responsive school-wide PBIS. If you're a teacher, you may or may not be familiar with the culturally responsive pedagogy, but essentially what this is suggesting is applying that pedagogy to school-wide positive behavior support. So essentially being intentional about addressing culture and race and ethnicity in the application of PBIS. One way researchers suggest you do this is by including family and student voices from different culture, racial, and ethnic groups when you are implementing PBIS. So in setting expectations, so finding common ground, discussing how you will acknowledge student behavior, so consequences you might put in place, and that could be positive or negative, right? And then saying, are people satisfied with PBIS? Not just the teachers and the administrators, but also the students who are being affected and the families. And so what I'd like to propose here, hopefully this is a little unique, is that disciplinary actions are a teacher behavior, right? So students don't exclude themselves from the classroom. They don't send themselves to the office or suspend themselves. So I'm going to pose this as you would a functional behavior assessment. So first we have an antecedent, right? So what happens before? So a student does something that's inappropriate for the classroom, right? And so the problem behavior in the context of disproportionality and discipline is that the teacher then removes the student from the classroom. That behavior is maintained or therefore more likely to occur because the teacher can then proceed with the instruction, provide support to other students, regain safety. These are just a few examples of things that make the teacher removing the student more likely to occur. But research suggests that there are some teacher thing strategies that we can put in place where teachers are making decisions about excluding students from the classroom. And I'll talk a little bit about those in the next slide. But the idea is that when PBIS is in place, students are able to stay in the classroom and teachers are able to use strategies that they have learned to address student behaviors. So that area where teachers are making decisions, McIntosh and colleagues call the vulnerable decision points. And so you can see the definition of what that means here. And so greet, stop, and prompt are classroom management strategies, self-regulation strategies, and reactive strategies. When implemented in 3 elementary schools, you see to the right in the figure an immediacy of effect. So that's where you see from baseline to the moment intervention starts, you see a decrease immediately in office disciplinary referrals on a weekly basis. And so the data shows that there was a 2/3 decrease in ODRs for Black students, and that students actually reported feeling more connected to their schools as by 15%. So really quickly going through these vulnerable decision points, the root causes. First, you want to know, what do I need to help support my students? So that's that first box there. Then you want to essentially, the GREET acronym is talking about creating a positive classroom climate. And so you can see what each of those letters stand for in that acronym. Then you must acknowledge that we all have biases, right? So that's addressing that implicit bias that I talked about in that 5th point of the intervention steps. And so that's this second box here. And so in doing so, the stop letters of the acronym help you to acknowledge, are my initial reactions appropriate and beneficial? And then just like you would say for a student about what skills are in their repertoire or should be added, you can also say about you for as the teacher. Then if administration, you're noticing, okay, we need to support our teachers a little more. What training and supports can you provide them? Okay, that's that box here. And then the prompt letters in the acronym help you to address the behavior and keep students in the environment. So that's things like managing low-level behavior, so proximity, redirection, prompting the student more privately, right? Being respectful of the student. So hopefully some major takeaways that you've gotten from this here is that in addressing the issue of disproportionality with PBIS, we must be intentional about addressing race and bias. So the greet, stop, and prompt are ways that teachers can specifically address implicit bias through their vulnerable decision points, okay? One way to include and be culturally responsive to students and families is by including them in the process. So if you have 70% of your student body are Hispanic or Latinx, you want to make sure you have different people of that group from maybe different places, maybe Ecuador, maybe Dominican Republic, at the table when you're making decisions. Furthermore, we must acknowledge that we all have biases. There's no exception. And so what we must do, though, is be intentional about addressing when those biases are playing a role. And then if disciplinary actions are teacher behavior, then just like we use PBIS to support our students, we can also use this to support our teachers and providing them and giving them the skills that they need to address behaviors in the classroom. Finally, these are the resources. So you may notice that 7 of them come from positive behavioral interventions and supports. I highly suggest going there. They have a lot of resources. Also, if you'd like to refer to a state who is currently in the process of doing this, Maryland may be a good example. Thank you for sitting through my presentation of positive behavior intervention and supports as it applies to the issue of disproportionality and discipline.